Hello and welcome to another episode of Random Fandom. This is your host, Mayhem. Today's topic of discussion is Wolverine. Over the last week, I had an opportunity to go and see The Wolverine, the sixth time that Hugh Jackman has been playing the character, the sixth time he's played the role. And so here I'm going to give my review of The Wolverine, as well as a breakdown of the goods, the bads, and what I feel the ranking of all of the X films and the entire X franchise are at this point. I'm going to try to make this fairly spoiler-free. I don't think I'm going to give anything away that you couldn't glean from watching the trailers and the previews, so don't worry if you haven't seen it yet. I don't think I'm going to be giving anything away here in this review. Overall, I thought it was very good. Some of the X films, especially the ones as of late, have been very, very missing the mark in terms of quality. But I thought this one was sort of a return to form. I don't think it was quite as good as X2, like what I feel is the best in the entire franchise. But I thought this was a very, very good installment into the X franchise. And it was a good movie to bring Wolverine back into being a really good character again, as he's kind of been messed up the last couple times out. So overall, yeah, I enjoyed it, but I'm going to get into some specifics. About specifically what I thought was good about it was it had a very solid story. A lot of times in comic book movies, the filmmakers get too far away from making a good story. They don't care about good writing or a good plot or anything, and they just try to over-focus on the special effects and the CGIs and the superhero fighting and everything like that they lose telling an actual good story. I thought this one had a very, very solid story. The story that you can pick up from just watching the previews is that a guy whose life Wolverine saved in Japan years ago during World War II, he's getting old and he's dying, and he wants to sort of repay Wolverine for saving his life all those years ago. So Wolverine goes out to Japan to meet up with him and recollect about old times and see what this guy has to offer him. And Wolverine gets caught up in a sort of turf war that's going on between this guy whose life he saved, his company, and the Japanese mafia, the Yakuza. And so he's meeting all of these characters who are involved in Japanese politics and who are in the Yakuza, and he ends up fighting on the side of his friend whose life he saved. So I thought that was a very solid story. I mean, it was a lot better than some of the X stories of the previous movies, where they really just were looking for any excuse to have superhuman characters fighting one another. So this movie, it almost played out more like a political thriller or like a spy story or something than a comic book movie. I actually equated this to being like a Bourne movie, like Jason Bourne, except with Wolverine in place of Jason Bourne. Because that's what a lot of the action sequences feel like, and that's what the story feels like. It's, the Jason Bourne stories is a guy who wants to be left alone. He's got this really entangled past, but he just wants to be left alone to live his life. Yet he gets pulled back into all of these problems between powerful people and gets used as a pawn against other powerful people and has to fight his way out of it. That's kind of exactly what this story was. And it didn't have a lot of over-the-top, super-powered stuff going on, so you could almost think of it sort of like a Jason Bourne movie, just with Wolverine in place of Jason Bourne. And another good thing about this was Hugh Jackman. I mean, there's a lot of people who have been criticizing Wolverine in the X franchise ever since it started back in 2000, saying that all of the movies are too centered on Wolverine. And now he's the only one of the entire X-Men who got his own solo movie, and now he's got 2 solo movies, and people are just sick and tired of seeing him. Jackman owns this role as far as I'm concerned. He does it so well, and I love seeing Hugh Jackman play the character. And if he ever started slipping, if he ever started doing it poorly or not living up to my expectations of the character, believe me, I'd be the first one to call him out on it for bad acting. but he owns the role. And in this time, I feel he did the character better in this movie than he did in the previous Wolverine movie. Not that I had too much problems with the way he played it back then either, but this felt very much more heartfelt. He felt like his heart was more in what he was doing here than he did back with the stuff in X-Men Origins Wolverine. So you really felt the character's emotion in this one, more than just violence and anger and rage. He also comes across protective and loving and caring towards people that he meets and forms bonds with. So I really enjoy Hugh Jackman playing this character, and I thought he knocked it out of the park in playing the character, especially in this movie. And one more good thing about this movie is the after credit scene. I won't say what it is, I won't spoil anything about it, but definitely stick around for the after credit scene. It's amazing, it's epic, you gotta stick around for it. But that's all I'll say about that. So a lot of good was in this movie, but it wasn't a perfect movie. It had a couple of flaws as well. One thing that I felt was a flaw was that there was not an overabundance of interesting characters aside from Wolverine. Wolverine really had to carry this entire movie. There were a couple of other characters who were okay. The redheaded Japanese woman who ends up coming to find him, she's a fairly interesting character. But then beyond that, really nobody else really reached out and grabbed, at least me. I don't think the rest of the audience either. Viper's in this movie, and from the previews, it looks like she's a very interesting character, and to some degree she is, but she also doesn't do a whole hell of a lot. She's doing stuff behind the scenes most of the time, so she's not always right front and center doing anything, and she doesn't have a lot of dialogue scenes either, which I think one of the reasons for that is the actress. She's originally from Russia. She's overdubbed through the movie, and it becomes a little bit apparent. You can sort of tell that she's overdubbed, and it's a little bit distracting, and I think that's one of the reasons why they didn't give her a lot of dialogue scenes, because they didn't want that to become too apparent. But her character is not quite as interesting as the previews made her out to be. And then there's a lot of people in the family of this Japanese guy who brought Wolverine over to Tokyo, and you meet a bunch of them, but they all just seem kind of generic, cookie-cutter, villainous characters. They're kind of greedy, they're wanting the old man to die so they can take over his company and stuff like that. Kind of one-dimensional, not a lot of depth to those characters. And that sort of is a double-edged sword, because it really did give Hugh Jackman a chance to shine in the main role, and the entire film hinged on him, and I think he lived up to that. He did a successful job with the entire film sitting on his own shoulders, but I would have liked to seen some more other interesting characters come out of the movie as well. And I would have liked to seen some more other X characters, because aside from Viper, there's nobody else really from the mutant side of things. So you don't get any other characters out of the comic book or out of Wolverine's past that are coming into this movie and showing up. And I was figuring that there would be characters who we didn't even see in the previews, that they were just leaving in reserve and you would be surprised by them when you went to see the movie. But there wasn't really. Pretty much everybody you saw that were prominent characters in the previews tended to be all the characters who were prominent in the movie. So like I said, that does give Jackman a chance to shine through with the entire movie being held up on his own shoulders, but I would have preferred to see one or two more prominent characters make their way into the film. But that was really the only bad thing I had to say about the film, not quite having enough interesting characters in it. But the action scenes were great, the fighting scenes were well choreographed, and the fights were well done. Like I said, even though he has superpowers, it didn't really feel like you were watching too much in the way of superpowered fights. It almost felt more like a Jason Bourne movie with one guy who was just really well-trained and a really good fighter, kicking ass out of Yakuza and agents and police and whatnot, anybody who needed to be fighting at the time. So the action scenes were good, the fight scenes were well done, the acting on Hugh Jackman's part, the story, the plot. Pretty well all the stuff that I really focus on when I go to see movies shined through in this one. So I enjoyed this one up and down. I thought it was a very, very good entry into the X-Men film franchise. And on a 4-star scale, I'd give this one a solid 3 stars. It wasn't perfect, but it was much better than I anticipated it being. After the last Wolverine movie and after some of the last X-Men movies, I was kind of thinking this one was going to be not that great, but I was pleasantly surprised. Turned out to be better than I anticipated. So 3 out of 4 stars for the Wolverine. Now, as to where I place it on the ranking of the X films, there's been 6 films. X-Men 1 back in 2000, X2, X3, that was the trilogy. Then we had X-Men Origins Wolverine, and then X-Men First Class a couple years back, and now this one, the Wolverine. The way I would rank them, from best to worst, starts off with X2. X2 I thought was absolutely phenomenal. I thought it was one of the best comic book movies ever made. It's in my top 5 of best comic book movies ever. I love the way they did it. Even though they had a lot of characters in it, usually when they do that, it feels bogged down, and you don't get enough character exposition with any one character because it's just jumping from one to the next too quickly. I love the way they handled it, and I loved every character in it. Stryker the bad guy, even Lady Deathstrike, even though I would have liked to seen more with her. I thought they had a very good fight scene between her and Wolverine. And Nightcrawler was in it. I love seeing Nightcrawler. He's one of my favorite X-Men characters. Just loved everything about that entire movie. The plot, the story, the action, everything. So X2 definitely goes at the top of the list in terms of the X franchise. After that is X-Men, the first one from back in 2000. Not enough credit is given to that first X-Men film. A lot of people don't seem to realize that was the movie that almost more than any other comic book movie made people start taking comic book movies seriously in Hollywood. You know, before that, there were the Tim Burton Batman movies. They were well respected. There were the Superman movies from back in the 80s that were fairly well respected, some of them more than others. And they were okay. They were thought of as being okay, but even those, even the Tim Burton ones and even Superman 2, were still sort of hokey. They still very much seemed like they were taking place in a stylized comic book world. X-Men, the first X-Men movie, was really the first one that made it seem like it was set in the real world, in our world. And after that, after X-Men in 2000, they started blowing up. That's when they did Spider-Man after that in the Spider-Man trilogy. That's when they started farming out the Marvel properties for the Iron Man and all the Marvel properties we have in the Marvel Cinematic Universe after that. Captain America, Thor, and the Avengers and all that. So it was X-Men that really started that craze rolling. So I loved it when I went to see it. I went to see that film more times in theaters than up to that point I had ever seen a movie in theaters. I just kept going back every other day to see that one again and again and again. So I loved X-Men. So that goes just below X2 on my list of the rankings. Thirdly would be this one, The Wolverine. Like I said, I loved the plot, I loved the story, I loved the way Hugh Jackman played the character. And everything about it was just solid, through and through solid. So that one goes in the 3rd spot. And after that, after those 3 movies, then the other X-Men films start to take a nosedive in terms of quality. I wouldn't consider any of the other ones to be really good. So the 4th spot on the list would be X-Men Origins Wolverine, the precursor to this one. I didn't hate it. I didn't hate X-Men Origins Wolverine. I didn't particularly like it, though. A lot of people I've talked to put this one completely on the bottom of the list. I didn't think it was worth being at the bottom of the list. A lot of that is because, again, it was Hugh Jackman. I like him playing the character, and a lot of X-Men Origins Wolverine hinged on him playing the character. So I thought he did a acceptable job there. And also, Liev Schreiber as Sabretooth was amazing. I loved him as Sabretooth. And the interplay between those two characters was enough in that movie for me to give it an okay rating. I sort of liked X-Men Origins Wolverine, even if Deadpool was completely screwed up, even if some of the effects were poorly done, even if some of the other acting from the guy who played Gambit was terrible. But Hugh Jackman playing Wolverine and Liev Schreiber as Sabretooth made that movie acceptable in my mind. So that one goes number 4 on the list. Number 5 on the list is X3. I can't really think of anything particularly good to say about X3. Even Hugh Jackman as Wolverine in that one, me liking him as Wolverine, still couldn't save that one. Everything about it was bad, except for one. I do have to give it props on them killing off Cyclops really early on, not even giving him an on-screen death. I don't like Cyclops, and that's putting it mildly. As a character in the comics or anything, I don't care for him at all. So when they killed him off really quick, didn't even bother to give him an on-screen death, that kind of made me chuckle clear through the entire rest of the movie. I mean, I know why they didn't. It wasn't really their choice. The actor, James Marsden, wanted to get out of there and go be in Superman Returns instead, which was sort of like quitting a job cleaning septic tanks to accept a job swimming in raw sewage. I mean, he quit X3 to go into Superman Returns, quit one piece of crap movie to go into another piece of crap movie. But anyway, so it kind of made me chuckle through the whole movie that they killed Cyclops off really quick. But everything beyond that was just absolutely terrible. I mean, the stuff they did with Juggernaut, I don't think I have to go into too much detail about how they screwed him up. And Angel was completely underutilized. He was in the movie for like 5 minutes, and they made such a big deal about him in the previews and the trailers and everything. They killed off virtually everybody throughout that entire movie, just one after another. People were dropping like flies. And so, yeah, absolutely terrible. It was a complete mess, and garbage X3 was. But it wasn't quite as bad as X-Men First Class, which goes on the bottom of the list as far as I'm concerned. Worst piece of garbage I've ever seen in terms of comic book movies. I have another video that I did about a month ago detailing a lengthy list of problems that I had with that movie, so check out my other video if you just want to hear me rag on everything that was wrong with X-Men First Class. And even though it's about 25 minutes long, I don't cover everything that's wrong with it. There was a lot of other stuff that was terribly wrong with X-Men First Class. Most of it didn't even have anything to do with continuity errors or being different from the comics or anything like that. Just the movie itself, everything about it sucked and was terrible. So I would even put that one, if we're talking any live-action X-Men films, there was a made-for-TV movie in the 90s for Generation X, the comic book Generation X. I would put that one above X-Men First Class if we were considering just all X-Men movies that were live action and not animated. That one would go above X-Men First Class. X-Men First Class was garbage. Absolute garbage. So that's my ranking. Best to worst, X2, then X-Men, this one, the Wolverine, X-Men Origins Wolverine, X3, and then X-Men First Class. So when it comes to the Wolverine, like I said, good movie. If you haven't gone and seen it yet, I certainly give it my stamp of approval. One of the better X-Men films in the franchise. More good than bad, not a perfect film, but better than I expected it to be. Before too much longer, next year I believe we will be having the next X-Men film, the 7th installment in the franchise, Days of Futures Past, so we'll see how that one shapes up, and when it does come out, I'll give you guys my synopsis and opinions on it. But until next time, thanks for listening. We'll see you guys next time on the next edition of Random Fandom.